Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I didn't expect to remember the smell of the gym floor so vividly, the sharp mix of polish and old sweat, or how the applause felt like a distant storm rolling over me instead of something met for my years. My name echoed through the speakers, and I stood when everyone else stood, my cap sitting crooked because my hands were shaking too much to fix it. I remember thinking I just needed to make it across the stage. That was the deal I made with myself. Just walk, smile, breathe. It had taken years to get here, years of late nights and early mornings, of learning to swallow disappointment and keep moving. I told myself this moment was proof that it had all been worth it. The lights were brighter than I expected, and when I stepped forward, my vision tunneled like I was looking through a cardboard tube. The applause grew louder, then strangely muffled, like someone had wrapped my head in cotton. I remember my foot catching on nothing at all, my knee buckling, the sudden fear that shot through me when my body didn't respond the way it always had. I remember thinking, not now, please not now, and then the floor rushed up to meet me. When I woke up, the world was white and humming. A machine beeped somewhere near my head, steady and unforgiving. My mouth tasted like metal. A nurse noticed my eyes flutter and leaned over me, her voice calm in that practiced way that tries to sound like reassurance even when it isn't. She asked me my name, the date, where I was. I answered slowly, my throat dry, my head pounding like I'd been split open. She told me I'd fainted at graduation and that they'd brought me to the hospital to be safe. She said it like it was no big deal, like this kind of thing happened all the time, but the look in her eyes didn't match her words. The doctor came later, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a clipboard held close to his chest. He asked questions that felt too serious for a simple fainting spell. Had I been eating, sleeping, feeling dizzy lately? I told him the truth, that I'd been tired, that I'd skipped meals to save money, that stress felt like a constant companion I couldn't shake. He nodded and ordered tests. Then he said they'd called my parents. He said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I nodded, relieved in a strange, hollow way. No matter how complicated things were at home, I still expected them to show up when it mattered. That's what parents did, I thought. Time stretched in the hospital the way it always does, minutes slipping past without meaning. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted the cracks. I listened to footsteps in the hall and tried to guess which ones belonged to my parents. I imagined my mother's tight smile, the way she'd fuss over the IV, my father's awkward pat on the shoulder. I braced myself for their disappointment, for the questions about why I hadn't taken better care of myself, why I'd embarrassed them on such an important day. Even then, lying there in a gown that felt too thin, I was preparing to apologize. The door opened and I turned my head, ready, but it wasn't my parents, it was my grandfather. He stood in the doorway like he'd run all the way there, chest heaving, hair wild, eyes wide with fear. His jacket was half-zipped, his shoes mismatched, one brown, one black. For a second, I thought maybe my parents were behind him, that he'd just arrived first, but the hallway behind him was empty. He took a few steps toward me, his hands trembling, and I felt something crack open in my chest. He reached my bedside and grabbed my hand like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. "Baby," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm here." That was it. No explanations, no excuses, just, "I'm here." The weight of that settled over me, heavy and warm and painful all at once. I asked where my parents were, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like a scared child, even though that's exactly how I felt. He looked away for a moment, jaw tight, eyes glistening. He said they'd called him because they couldn't reach my parents. He said he'd come as fast as he could. The doctor came back and explained what they knew so far, that my collapse wasn't just dehydration or nerves, that there were signs of something more serious going on. He talked about tests and monitoring and possible causes, his words clinical and careful. I watched my grandfather listen, nodding, asking questions, taking notes on a scrap of paper he pulled from his pocket. He asked things my parents never would have thought to ask. When the doctor left, my grandfather squeezed my hand and told me not to worry, that we'd get through this together. We. That word felt like a promise. As the hours passed, my phone buzzed with messages, congratulations texts from classmates, pictures of smiling faces in caps and gowns. A single text from my mother that said, "Are you okay? Let us know." No call, no rush, no urgency. I stared at the screen until it went dark again. My grandfather noticed and didn't say anything, but his grip tightened. He told me stories to distract me, stories about when he'd graduated, about his own father had cried in the stands. He told them like he was trying to stitch something together that had torn. I realized then how quiet my life had been when it came to real concern. My parents had always been present in the way furniture is present, occupying space without offering comfort. They valued appearances, achievements that reflected well on them. I learned early not to ask for much. Grandpa had been my refuge, the one who showed up to school plays, who slipped me $20 bills and told me to buy myself a good meal, who listened without judgment. Still, I never imagined he'd be the one sitting by my hospital bed on the day I graduated. Night fell outside the small window, the sky turning the color of bruises. My grandfather dozed in the chair, waking every time a nurse came in, every time I shifted. I watched his chest rise and fall and felt a swell of gratitude and grief tangled together. Whatever was wrong with me, whatever the tests would reveal, one truth was already clear. When everything stopped, when the lights went out and my body failed me, the person who came running was the one who had always loved me quietly, steadily, without conditions. And as I lay there, listening to the machines and the distant sounds of celebration echoing from a life I'd been pulled out of, I knew this was only the beginning of what I was about to learn.
Morning crept into the hospital room slowly, the pale light pressing through the blinds like it was unsure whether it was welcome. I hadn't slept much. Every time I drifted off, my body jolted awake, my mind replaying the moment I fell, the echo of applause turning into gasps. My grandfather was awake too, staring out the window with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He noticed my eyes open and gave me a soft smile, the kind that tries to hide worry but never quite succeeds. He asked how I was feeling, and I told him the truth, that I felt hollow, like something inside me had been scooped out and replaced with questions. The nurse came in to check my vitals, her movements efficient, her tone gentle. She told me my parents had called the nurse's station earlier that morning asking for an update. She said it like it was a good thing, like proof they cared. I nodded, even though the knot in my stomach tightened. Calling for updates felt different than being there. It felt like distance disguised as concern. My grandfather didn't comment, but I saw his jaw clench. Later, the doctor returned with test results. He closed the door behind him, which made my heart pound harder than any machine could. He explained that I had an underlying condition, something that had likely been building quietly for years, masked by youth and stubbornness. Stress, lack of proper nutrition, and exhaustion had pushed my body past its limit. He said it wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was serious enough that it couldn't be ignored. I'd need ongoing treatment, lifestyle changes, regular monitoring. I watched his lips move, the words washing over me like cold water. I was barely an adult, diploma not even in my hands yet, and suddenly my body came with instructions and warnings. My grandfather asked practical questions again. What did treatment look like? Could I still work? Would insurance cover it? The doctor answered as best he could. When he left, the room felt smaller, heavier. I finally asked the question that had been sitting on my chest since the night before. Why hadn't my parents come? My voice cracked despite my efforts. My grandfather sighed, the sound long and tired, like he'd been carrying this weight for a long time. He said he didn't want to speak ill of them, but he also didn't want to lie to me anymore. He told me my parents had been at a celebratory dinner the night before, one they'd planned weeks in advance. Important people, he said, business connections. They decided it was better not to leave and cause a scene. They assumed I'd be fine, that hospitals exaggerated things. Hearing it laid out so plainly hurt more than any dramatic explanation could have. It wasn't cruelty, it was indifference wrapped in confidence that I'd always manage on my own. Anger flickered through me, sharp and hot, followed by a familiar wave of shame for even feeling it. I'd spent my life excusing them, telling myself they did their best, that they showed love in their own way. Lying there with an IV in my arm, I couldn't pretend anymore. I felt like a prop in their story, something they could check on later once the important parts were done. My grandfather reached over and brushed my hair back the way he used to when I was small. He told me none of this was my fault. He said some people never learn how to show up when it counts. My parents arrived that afternoon. They walked in together, well-dressed, composed, like they were attending a meeting rather than visiting their child in a hospital bed. My mother gasped softly when she saw me, her hand flying to her chest. My father frowned at the machines, at the IV, like they offended him. They asked how I was, what happened, what the doctors said. Their questions came fast, almost frantic, but something about them felt rehearsed. I answered politely, carefully, the way I always did. My grandfather stood up and let them take his chair, but he didn't leave. He stayed by the window, arms crossed, watching. When the doctor returned to explain my condition again, my parents nodded, asked about timelines, about when I'd be discharged. My father asked when I could start working full-time. The doctor gently suggested I'd need rest and support. My mother smiled tightly and said, of course, family comes first. I wondered what family meant to her and whether it included sitting by my bed through the night. After they left, promising to come back later, the room felt quieter than before. I stared at the ceiling again, the cracks now familiar. My grandfather broke the silence. He said he'd talked to my parents before, years ago, about slowing down, about paying attention to what really mattered. They'd laughed it off. Success waits for no one, they'd said. He told me he'd been saving money for me, just in case I ever needed a safety net. I protested, embarrassed, but he waved me off. He said he wanted me to have choices he never had. The days blurred together after that. Tests, consultations, pamphlets full of information I was too overwhelmed to absorb. My parents visited sporadically, always with an eye on the clock. My grandfather was constant. He brought soup from home, insisted I eat. He argued with insurance representatives on the phone, his voice firm and unwavering. He listened when I cried, when the fear finally spilled out of me in quiet, shaking sobs late one night. He didn't try to fix it. He just stayed. I was discharged a week later with instructions and prescriptions and a new awareness of my own fragility. My parents offered to take me home, but my grandfather spoke up before I could answer. He said I'd be staying with him for a while, where he could keep an eye on me. My parents hesitated, exchanged looks, then agreed. Relief washed over me so strongly I nearly cried again. Moving into my grandfather's small, cluttered house felt like stepping into a different world.
It smelled like old books and coffee and something comforting I couldn't name. He set up the guest room for me, fussing over pillows and blankets. He reminded me to take my medication, to rest, to listen to my body. For the first time, taking care of myself felt like something I was allowed to do. As I healed physically, something else began to surface. Memories I'd brushed aside, moments when I'd felt alone even in a full house, expectations I'd been trying to meet without ever being sure why. I started to understand that my collapse hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of pushing myself to be enough for people who measured love and achievements. Sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table one afternoon, sipping tea, I realized that surviving wasn't the same as living. And for the first time since I could remember, I wondered what my life might look like if I stopped performing and started choosing.
Living with my grandfather slowed time in a way I wasn't used to. Mornings didn't start with alarms screaming or a rush to be productive. They began with the sound of him humming softly in the kitchen, the smell of toast, the scrape of a chair on the floor. At first, I felt guilty for resting, like I was doing something wrong by not constantly moving toward the next goal. That feeling sat heavy in my chest, even heavier than the diagnosis. My grandfather noticed. He told me healing wasn't laziness. He said bodies, like hearts, needed patience more than pressure. Appointments became part of our routine. He drove me every time, waiting in the car or the lobby with a book he never seemed to read. The doctors adjusted medications, talked about long-term management. I learned new words for what my body was doing, learned to listen for signals instead of ignoring them. It was strange how something as simple as eating regularly or sleeping enough felt like an act of rebellion. My parents called occasionally. Sometimes they asked about my health. Sometimes they asked about my plans. Had I applied for jobs yet? Was I thinking about graduate school? Their concern always drifted back to productivity, as if being still frightened them. I answered carefully, sharing just enough to keep the peace. My grandfather never listened in, never commented afterward unless I asked. He respected my boundaries even when I wasn't sure how to set them myself. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found a stack of report cards and certificates my grandfather had kept. Plays I'd been in, science fairs I barely remembered, even a crumpled drawing from when I was 5. On the back, in shaky handwriting, he'd written, "So proud of you." I sat on the dusty floor and cried harder than I had in the hospital. All those years, someone had been paying attention. That night, I asked him why he'd always been there, even when my parents hadn't. He took a long time to answer. He said he'd grown up invisible, one of too many children, praised only when useful. He promised himself he'd never make someone feel the way he did. He said love was supposed to feel like shelter, not a test you could fail. Hearing that reshaped something in me. I realized I'd been chasing approval from people who didn't know how to give it, while overlooking the quiet, steady love already surrounding me. As my strength returned, so did the pressure from my parents. They invited me back home, insisting it would be easier for everyone. I knew what that meant. Easier for them. Easier to slip back into old patterns where my needs came last. The thought made my chest tighten. For the first time, I said no. My voice shook, but I said it anyway. I told them I needed more time, that my health had to come first. There was a pause on the line, then disappointment, sharp and familiar. But beneath it, there was something new, distance. And with that distance came clarity. Graduation photos arrived in the mail, glossy reminders of a day that hadn't gone as planned. I flipped through them with my grandfather. In one picture, just before I collapsed, my smile looked forced, my eyes tired. He pointed it out gently and said he'd always seen how hard I pushed myself. He said he was proud of me not for finishing school, but for surviving everything that came with it. Weeks turned into months. I started therapy, learning to untangle my worth from my output. It was harder than any class I'd ever taken. Some days the anger toward my parents surged unexpectedly. Other days, grief washed over me for the relationship I wished we'd had. Through it all, my grandfather remained my anchor. He celebrated small victories like they were milestones: a good lab result, a day without exhaustion, a laugh that came easily instead of being forced. One evening, my parents came by unannounced. They stood in the doorway, looking around the familiar house like guests in someone else's life. My mother commented on how thin I'd gotten, how quiet I seemed. My father asked if I was ready to move forward yet. Something inside me finally settled. I told them forward didn't mean faster, it meant healthier. It meant choosing environments where I could breathe. The words surprised all of us, including me. After they left, my grandfather squeezed my shoulder and told me he was proud again. The simple consistency of it made my eyes sting. I realized then that collapsing at graduation hadn't just stopped my body, it had stopped the story I'd been living on autopilot. It forced me to see who showed up when there was nothing to gain, and it gave me permission to build a future defined by care instead of constant proving. As summer faded into fall, the world outside my grandfather's house shifted in subtle ways. Leaves piled up along the curb, mornings turned crisp, and the light slanted differently through the windows. Inside, my life felt quieter but deeper, like a river that had finally slowed enough for me to see what was beneath the surface. I began to notice how often I'd been holding my breath before, how my shoulders had lived up near my ears, braced for judgment I didn't even realize I was expecting. Here, with my grandfather, I exhaled. My health stabilized, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because I was finally paying attention. I learned the difference between being tired and being depleted, between ambition and fear. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. They reminded me this was a long road, not a sprint. For once, that didn't scare me. It felt like permission. My parents' calls became less frequent. When they did reach out, there was a stiffness to our conversations, like we were all aware something fundamental had shifted, but no one knew how to name it. My mother would ask if I'd thought any more about moving back. My father would mention opportunities, connections he could make. I listened, thanked them, and declined. Each time the guilt came, but it was quieter now, easier to set aside. One afternoon, my grandfather asked me to help him clean out the garage. It was a slow task, punctuated by breaks and stories. We found old photo albums, tools he hadn't used in years, boxes labeled in careful handwriting. In one box, I found letters addressed to him from my parents, written decades ago. They were full of frustration and resentment, complaints about expectations and pressure. Reading them felt like looking into a mirror of the past. I understood then that my parents hadn't invented their way of loving, they'd inherited it. That knowledge softened something in me, not enough to excuse their absence, but enough to understand it. That evening, I asked my grandfather if he ever regretted how things turned out with them. He shook his head slowly. He said regret was heavy, and he'd learned to put it down. He loved them the best way he knew how, even when it wasn't returned. He said love didn't guarantee closeness, but it did offer peace if you let it. I started volunteering a few days a week at a local community center, helping kids with homework. It felt strange to be useful without being judged. They didn't care about my degree or my plans. They cared that I listened, that I showed up. Each afternoon left me tired but fulfilled in a way I'd never known. I realized how much I valued being present over being impressive. My parents visited again near the holidays. Tension filled the room like static. Over dinner, my father asked about my future in a tone that suggested impatience. I surprised myself by answering honestly. I told them I didn't know yet, and that for once that uncertainty felt healthy. My mother frowned, said she worried I was settling. I told her settling felt different than choosing. The table went quiet. My grandfather cleared his throat and changed the subject, but later he told me he was glad I'd spoken up. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the day I collapsed, how everything had gone dark and quiet, forcing the truth to the surface. I realized my body had done what my mind couldn't. It had stopped me before I could disappear into expectations that were never mine. As the year ended, I wrote a letter to my parents I never sent. In it, I thanked them for what they'd provided and acknowledged what they hadn't. Writing it felt like setting something down. I didn't need them to read it to feel its weight lift. The new year arrived without fanfare, no resolutions, no grand plans, just a commitment to listen to my body, my instincts, my needs. Sitting at the kitchen table with my grandfather, watching steam rise from our mugs, I felt a quiet confidence settle in. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew who I wanted beside me. Spring arrived gently, like it didn't want to startle me. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and with it came a subtle shift inside me. I noticed I laughed more easily now, that my body didn't feel like an enemy I had to negotiate with every morning. Healing wasn't linear, the doctors reminded me, and some days were harder than others. But even on the difficult days, I no longer felt alone. That made all the difference. My grandfather and I developed small rituals. We walked around the block in the evenings, slowly, him pointing out flowers by their names, stories attached to each one. He told me about my grandmother, about how she used to say that love was shown in the smallest, most repetitive ways. Feeding someone, waiting with them, listening even when you were tired. I realized those were the lessons he'd been teaching me all along without ever saying them out loud. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother that felt different. Her voice was quieter, less guarded. She told me my father had been having trouble sleeping, that he was worried about me even if he didn't know how to say it. I listened without interrupting. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing anything. I told her I hoped he was okay and that I was focusing on my health. The conversation ended gently, without tension or expectations. When I hung up, I felt a surprising sense of peace. I started to imagine a future that wasn't built around proving something. I looked into part-time work that aligned with my energy instead of draining it. I enrolled in a short course purely out of interest, not because it looked impressive. Each decision felt radical in its simplicity. My grandfather watched all of this with quiet pride. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees, he told me something that startled me. He said that when the hospital called him on the day I collapsed, he'd been afraid he'd lose me before I ever really lived. He said showing up that day wasn't a choice, it was instinct. Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. I realized how rare it was to be loved like that, without hesitation. A few weeks later, my parents invited me to dinner at their house. I hesitated before agreeing. Walking back into that space felt like stepping into an old version of myself. They tried hard, I could tell. My mother asked about my health with genuine concern. My father listened more than he spoke. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. At one point, my father admitted he hadn't known how serious things were at graduation. The apology was small and awkward, but it existed. I accepted it without ceremony. I didn't need more than that. Driving back to my grandfather's house that night, I understood something important. Closure didn't mean everything was fixed. It meant I no longer needed the past to be different in order to move forward. As months passed, my strength continued to return. I learned to trust my body again, to respect its limits. I also learned to trust myself. The collapse that once felt like a failure now felt like an intervention. It forced me to reevaluate everything: who I was living for, what I believed I owed others, and what I deserved in return. On the anniversary of my graduation, my grandfather and I celebrated quietly. No caps or gowns, just a shared meal and laughter. He toasted to my resilience, to new beginnings. I toasted to second chances. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how close I'd come to losing myself chasing approval. I thought about the hospital room, the empty doorway, and the one person who walked through it. That image had become my compass. When I doubted myself, I returned to it. I fell asleep knowing that while my story had started with collapse, it was no longer defined by it. I was still learning, still healing, but I was finally moving toward a life that felt like my own.
By the time summer returned, I realized how much my definition of success had changed. It no longer sounded like applause or looked like framed certificates on a wall. It felt quieter, steadier, like waking up without dread and going to sleep without regret. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. It simply showed up in how I lived. I began working part-time at the community center, officially this time. The kids recognized me now, ran toward me when I arrived, tugged on my sleeves to show me drawings or complain about homework. They didn't know about my collapse or my diagnosis. They just knew I listened. Some days after they left, I sat alone in the empty room and let the silence settle. It felt earned. My parents and I settled into an unspoken rhythm. We spoke occasionally, carefully, like people relearning a language they once spoke poorly. There were still moments of tension, especially when they slipped into old habits of measuring my life against invisible yardsticks. But now I noticed it without absorbing it. I could see where their fear ended and mine began. That separation was new, and it was freeing. One afternoon, my father asked if I'd ever considered that my collapse might have scared them more than they let on. The comment surprised me. I told him fear looked different on everyone. Some people run toward it, some people freeze. He didn't respond right away, but later he texted me to say he was glad I was taking care of myself. It wasn't dramatic, it was enough. My grandfather's health began to slow him down a little. Nothing alarming, just the natural rhythm of age making itself known. I found myself watching him more closely, mirroring the care he'd given me without thinking twice. I drove him to his appointments, reminded him to rest, cooked when he was tired. He laughed and said roles were reversing. I told him love didn't keep score. One evening, we sat together looking through the graduation program I'd kept folded in a drawer. My name was printed there, a reminder of a day that had changed everything. He asked if I regretted it, collapsing, the interruption, the way things had unfolded. I shook my head. I told him if I hadn't stopped that day, I might never have stopped at all. He nodded, like he understood completely. I started speaking openly about my experience when it felt right, not for sympathy, but for honesty. I learned how many people carried similar stories, moments when their bodies or lives forced them to reckon with truths they'd been avoiding. Sharing mine didn't make me feel exposed, it made me feel connected. As the year edged forward, I felt something like gratitude settle in, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that shows up in ordinary moments, in shared meals, in honest conversations, in choosing rest without apology. Looking back, the most shocking part of collapsing at my graduation wasn't the fall itself, it was what rose in its place: clarity, boundaries, a deeper understanding of love. I learned that showing up matters more than titles, that care speaks louder than pride, and that sometimes the people who come when you fall are the ones who have been waiting all along. There's a strange kind of courage that comes after survival, the kind that doesn't announce itself but quietly changes the way you stand in the world. By the time another year had passed since my graduation, I could feel that courage in small choices, saying no without over-explaining, resting without guilt, letting silence exist in conversations instead of filling it with performance. My life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were setbacks with my health, days when fatigue crept back in without warning, moments when fear whispered that everything could fall apart again. But now I knew what to do with that fear. I didn't outrun it. I sat with it. I listened. And most importantly, I didn't face it alone. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve, slowly and unevenly. There were times when old wounds reopened unexpectedly, a careless comment, a familiar pressure. But there were also moments of genuine effort. My mother started asking how I felt instead of what I planned to do. My father began listening without immediately offering solutions. They were small shifts, but they mattered. I stopped waiting for them to become different people and instead met them where they were, with boundaries firmly in place. One evening, my father admitted something he'd never said before. He told me that when the hospital called him that day, panic had set in, but pride had kept him rooted. He said he'd convinced himself I was strong enough, that things would be fine, because the alternative was admitting he might lose me. Hearing that didn't erase the hurt, but it explained it. I realized then that love could exist alongside failure, and that understanding didn't require forgetting. My grandfather remained the steady center of my life. Watching him move more slowly now, I understood time differently. I no longer measured it by accomplishments, but by presence. We talked often about the future, not in terms of plans, but hopes. He told me he hoped I'd always choose people who showed up. I promised him I would. One quiet afternoon, sitting in the same kitchen where so much of my healing had taken place, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked if I'd ever forgiven my parents. I thought about it for a long time. I told him forgiveness, for me, wasn't a moment. It was a practice. Some days I was there, some days I wasn't, and that was okay. He smiled and said healing was rarely tidy. As the sun dipped low, I reflected on how close I'd come to missing this version of my life. If I hadn't collapsed that day, I might have walked straight into a future that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. My body had forced me to listen when I refused to hear myself. I thought again of the hospital room, of the door opening, of my grandfather's mismatched shoes and terrified eyes. That image no longer filled me with sadness. It filled me with certainty. Love wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was presence. Now when I look ahead, I don't see a straight path or a perfect plan. I see something better. A life built with intention, with rest, with people who come when called, and some who come even when they aren't. I see a version of myself who knows her worth isn't tied to how much she can endure. And as I sit here telling you this, I realize something else. My graduation didn't end on that stage. It ended in a hospital room, with one man showing up when others didn't. And that lesson became the foundation for everything that followed. The thing about closure is that it doesn't arrive with fireworks. It slips in quietly, almost unnoticed, like a deep breath you didn't realize you were holding. By the time I understood that my story was settling into something whole, my life already looked different in ways I once thought were impossible. Not bigger, not louder, just truer. My grandfather's house had become more than a place to recover. It was where I learned how to live without constantly bracing myself. The walls held laughter now, not just echoes. I cooked meals without rushing, read books without guilt, rested without needing to justify it. And every day, in 100 small ways, I practiced choosing myself. My health required ongoing care, but it no longer defined me. It informed my decisions instead of controlling them. I learned when to push gently and when to stop completely. That balance, once terrifying, became second nature. I wasn't weak for needing rest. I was wise for taking it. One morning, while helping my grandfather sort paperwork, I came across the hospital bill from the day I collapsed. I stared at the date for a long time. It felt strange to see it reduced to ink and numbers, knowing how monumental it had been to me. My grandfather noticed my silence and said softly that some days change everything, even if the world doesn't notice. I folded the paper carefully and realized he was right. That day had split my life into before and after. My parents and I found a fragile but honest rhythm. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't relive it either. There was an unspoken understanding now, shaped by distance and growth. They knew I would no longer sacrifice myself to meet expectations that harmed me, and somehow that honesty made our relationship lighter, not perfect, but real. I visited my old campus one afternoon alone. The gym was quiet, empty of applause and ceremony. I stood near the stage where I'd fallen and felt a surprising calm wash over me. The shame I once carried was gone. In its place was gratitude. That space had witnessed my breaking, but it had also set me free. Later that week, I framed my diploma and hung it in my grandfather's hallway, not because it proved anything, but because it reminded me of resilience. He stood beside me, arm around my shoulders, and said he wished my grandmother were there to see the woman I'd become. I told him she already knew. As time moved forward, I began mentoring others quietly, people who were burning themselves out trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I never told them what to do. I just listened. Sometimes that was enough to help them pause, enough to help them breathe. On the anniversary of my collapse, my grandfather and I visited the park. We sat on a bench, watching families pass, children laughing, life unfolding without ceremony. He squeezed my hand and told me he was proud of the life I was building, not the achievements, the life. That distinction mattered more than he knew. I realized then that love isn't proven in emergencies alone. It's proven in consistency, in showing up when no one is watching, in staying. My grandfather had taught me that not with speeches, but with presence, and that lesson reshaped everything. When I look back now, I don't see a girl who failed on stage. I see someone whose body demanded truth when her mind couldn't. I see a family learning, imperfectly, how to love better. And I see a grandfather who answered a call without hesitation, reminding me that sometimes the person who comes for you reveals everything you need to know about your worth. I didn't graduate the way I imagined, but I graduated into myself, into a life where love feels safe, rest feels allowed, and showing up matters more than appearances ever could. And if there's one thing I carry with me from that day, it's this: when everything falls apart, pay attention to who walks through the door. They are the ones who will help you build something new. If you'd asked me back then what I thought the future looked like, I would have described something sharp and shiny, a life built on milestones and proof. Now, when I think about the future, it looks softer. It sounds like quiet mornings and honest conversations. It feels like knowing when to stop and trusting that stopping doesn't mean failing. That shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded the way healing usually does, slowly, unevenly, with moments of doubt stitched between moments of certainty. My grandfather used to say that the real work of living happens after the applause fades. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I thought the applause was the point. Standing on that stage, moments before I collapsed, I was waiting for validation to wash over me and finally make me feel complete. Instead, I fell. And in that fall, I learned that completion doesn't come from being seen by crowds. It comes from being known by the people who show up when no one else is watching. Life kept moving, as it always does. Seasons changed, kids at the community center grew taller and more confident. Some of them moved on, new ones took their place. I stayed, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was something grounding about consistency, about being a familiar face someone could count on. It reminded me that impact isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just being there, again and again. My parents and I reached a place that felt honest, if not perfect. We stopped pretending we'd always understood each other. We stopped rewriting the past. Instead, we focused on the present, on conversations that didn't revolve around expectations, but around connection. There were still boundaries, there always would be, but there was also mutual respect, something we'd never fully had before. One afternoon, my mother asked me a question that surprised us both. She asked if I was happy, not successful, not busy, happy. I paused before answering, really checking in with myself. Then I said yes. The word felt solid when I spoke it. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and said that was all she'd ever wanted, even if she hadn't known how to show it. I believed her. And for the first time, that belief didn't cost me anything. My grandfather aged more visibly as time went on. His steps grew slower, his naps longer. I learned to treasure ordinary moments with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Folding laundry together, sharing soup, sitting in comfortable silence. I knew these were the memories that would last, the ones I'd return to when life inevitably asked more of me. One evening, as we watched the sunset from the porch, he told me something I carry with me every day. He said, "You didn't just survive that day, you listened." I realized then that listening to my body, my needs, my truth, had been the bravest thing I'd ever done. Sometimes people ask me about my graduation. They expect a story about embarrassment or disappointment. I tell them the truth. I tell them it was the day my life changed direction, the day I learned what love looks like in action, the day I stopped confusing endurance with strength. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about collapsing or hospitals or even family. It's about paying attention, about noticing who shows up, about allowing yourself to be held when you're tired of holding everything together. I didn't graduate with honors and fanfare the way I imagined. I graduated with clarity, with boundaries, with a deeper understanding of what and who truly matters. And that kind of graduation doesn't come with a cap and gown. It comes with courage, quiet choices, and the willingness to start over in a way that finally feels like home. There are moments in life that don't feel important while you're living them. Moments so ordinary they barely register, until one day you look back and realize they were holding everything together. For me, those moments came after all the drama was supposed to be over, after the hospital, after the fear, after the conversations and the apologies and the slow rebuilding. They came quietly, in the aftermath, where real life always waits. One of those moments happened on a random Tuesday morning. I was standing in my grandfather's kitchen, barefoot, sunlight spilling across the floor, making dust particles glow like they mattered. He was at the table, carefully buttering toast, moving slower than he used to, but still humming the same tune. I realized then that this calm, unremarkable morning was something I never would have allowed myself before. I would have been rushing, thinking about what I should be doing instead, who I needed to impress, how far behind I might be. That morning, I was just there, and it felt like success. My health continued to require attention, but it no longer felt like a threat looming over me. It became part of my rhythm, like checking the weather before going outside. I learned how to advocate for myself with doctors, how to say no when my body needed rest, how to recognize warning signs without panicking. There was power in that knowledge, not the kind that demands control, but the kind that builds trust between you and yourself. I eventually moved into a small place of my own, not far from my grandfather's house, close enough to visit often, far enough to feel independent. The day I signed the lease, he hugged me for a long time. He didn't give advice, he didn't warn me, he just said he was proud of me for building a life that fit instead of forcing myself into one that didn't. I carried that sentence with me like a talisman. My relationship with my parents settled into something stable, if imperfect. We learned to meet each other without rehearsed roles. They stopped asking when I would be more. I stopped shrinking to make them comfortable. Sometimes there was still distance, but it no longer felt like rejection. It felt like acceptance of reality. And that, I learned, was a form of peace. I returned to the hospital once, months later, not as a patient, but as a visitor. A friend's younger sister had been admitted, scared and overwhelmed. Sitting beside her bed, I recognized the look in her eyes, the uncertainty, the quiet fear of being a burden. I told her she wasn't weak for being there. I told her bodies speak when we don't listen, and that it's brave to stop. As I said the words, I realized I finally believed them. Time did what time always does. It moved forward, indifferent and steady. My grandfather's steps slowed further. His memory softened at the edges. There came a day when I found him asleep in his chair, sunlight warming his face, his breathing deep and peaceful. I stood there for a long moment, overwhelmed by gratitude and the sharp ache of knowing nothing lasts forever. He woke and smiled at me like I was exactly where I belonged. Not long after, he sat me down and asked me to promise him something. He asked me to promise I would never again measure my worth by how much I could endure. He said life would test me enough without me testing myself. I promised, and I meant it. Sometimes, I still think about that graduation day, about the stage, the lights, the sudden darkness. I think about how embarrassed I felt at first, how small I believed I'd become in front of everyone. Now, when I revisit that memory, I see it differently. I see a body that refused to be ignored. I see a truth that demanded attention. I see a door opening and one person stepping through without hesitation. If my parents had come that day, maybe things would have unfolded differently. Maybe I wouldn't have learned the lesson the way I did. Maybe I would have gone back to performing, to proving, to pushing myself until something else broke. Instead, the person who came was the one who loved me without conditions, and that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I share this story not because collapse is noble or pain is necessary, but because sometimes the moment we think ruined everything is the moment that saved us. Sometimes the absence we feel most deeply reveals the presence that truly matters. Today, my life is quieter than the one I once imagined, but it is fuller. I wake up knowing who I am without checking anyone else's expectations first. I choose rest without apology. I surround myself with people who show up. And when I think about success now, I don't picture applause. I picture a hospital room, a frightened old man in mismatched shoes, and the realization that love had found me exactly where I fell. That was my real graduation, not the one with the cap and gown, but the one where I finally learned how to live.